You know, sometimes when I give a lecture, I really get tired out. It takes a lot of energy to give a good lecture, and I really use a lot of ATP in the process. In fact, it takes a lot of energy just to live. Remember, I told you that a vertebrate animal, such as myself, might consume its body weight in ATP every day. In my case, that's going to be over 180 pounds of ATP that I'm using up. It's at times like this that I'm especially glad that my cells are able to perform cellular respiration, using the biochemical pathways that we've been discussing over the last several lectures to recharge all those spent ADPs and turn them back into ATP. As long as my cells keep regenerating ATP, it's almost like I have an inexhaustible supply of energy to keep going. Well, almost, but not quite. You see, of course, my cells only keep generating ATP as long as they have some fuel, like glucose or another organic compound, to power that process. Therefore, in order to keep generating ATP, I have to eat something, because it's the food I eat that ultimately supplies the organic compounds that fuel cellular respiration and oxidative phosphorylation in my cells to make all that ATP. Now, if I didn't have to eat, I'd be violating the second law of thermodynamics. This is because the only way a system can maintain orderliness and a high energy state over the long run is to continually add energy from someplace outside that system. As a living system myself, I can only maintain my current orderly state and high energy state if I have some constant supply of organic molecules to feed the process of cellular respiration. Otherwise, I'd use up what energy I had, and eventually I'd cease to live. Now, ultimately, the only way I personally can get more organic fuel for my cellular respiration is to eat it. By eating organic material, I gain energy from it, and that's how I'm able to apparently defy the second law of thermodynamics. But I'm not really defying the second law because I'm getting energy into me from the outside. Now, remember, I don't have to eat just glucose. As I told you last time, I can eat any number of other kinds of organic compounds to get energy. And this is because, as we saw, the biochemical pathways of cellular respiration stand at what's essentially a metabolic crossroads. A crossroads of all of the highly interconnected pathways that run the reactions of the cell. Fats and proteins and other more complex carbohydrates all can be processed and fed into the pathways of cellular respiration to generate ATP. But I do have to eat something. The only way I get more organic compounds to fuel my cellular respiration is by eating something else that's made of those organic compounds. And actually, the only way I can do this is by eating some other living thing, or at least by eating something that used to be alive, because that's where organic compounds are found, in living things. Now, many kinds of organisms find themselves in the same position as I do. We call these kinds of organisms heterotrophs. This word literally means other feeders, or if we want to turn it around to spell it out a little bit more, feeders on others. Not all organisms are heterotrophs, however. Some kind of organisms are what we call autotrophs, which literally means self-feeders. Now, it's a good thing that there are some autotrophs in this world. If all organisms were heterotrophs, then eventually we'd all run out of food. This is because the energy in these organic molecules that we consume eventually is lost from living systems, dissipated away in the form of heat, and once we've consumed an organic molecule, we can't get it back without some additional source of energy. The only source of energy I have is organic molecules that I eat. If everybody kept eating everybody else in this world, eventually there'd be nothing left. This is an inexorable consequence of the second law of thermodynamics. Now, autotrophs are able to make their own organic compounds. They're able to make their own food, as their name suggests. Ultimately, we heterotrophs get our organic compounds by eating autotrophs, or by eating other heterotrophs that have eaten an autotroph. As long as the autotrophs keep manufacturing food, keep manufacturing new organic compounds, then we're all okay. But as soon as we run out of autotrophs, then we heterotrophs are going to end up running down. Now, let's think about these autotrophs. I said that they can manufacture their own organic molecules. Does that mean that autotrophs are able to defy the second law of thermodynamics? No, not at all. The only way autotrophs can make high-energy organic compounds is by using some non-organic source of energy to power the anabolic reactions that are necessary to build these compounds. The vast majority of autotrophs in the world are green plants and green algae, along with a few other kinds of prokaryotes and single-celled eukaryotic organisms that all have in common the fact that they can use energy captured from sunlight in order to help them run anabolic reactions that will then synthesize high-energy organic compounds, such as sugars, from scratch. Thus, we might also call these kinds of organisms photoautotrophs. They get their energy from the sun. Now, there are a few kinds of autotrophs that get their energy elsewhere. These other kinds of autotrophs are actually usually living in very extreme environments where there's some alternate source of inorganic compound that has some energy. For example, hydrogen sulfide, that's H2S, found in deep sea thermal vents in abundance, can be used by some prokaryotic organisms to actually provide energy. But most autotrophs are using the sun. Now, the sun then is the ultimate source of energy for all life on the planet. Now, is the sun defying the second law of thermodynamics? Well, no, it isn't. The sun is burning up its own nuclear fuel. Essentially, in several billion years, estimates vary, but maybe somewhere about 5 billion years from now, the sun is going to run out of its nuclear fuels. And when it does, the sun will no longer produce energy. And when the sun stops producing energy, then all life on this planet will end. Well, that's kind of a depressing thought, isn't it? But we don't have to worry about it so much because 5 billion years is a long time from now. So let's just ask ourselves, what is the process by which this sunlight is captured by photoautotrophs? And as you might guess, the name of that process is photosynthesis. And it's photosynthesis which essentially makes all life on the planet possible. Now, the energy used by photosynthetic organisms, such as green plants and algae, to power their anabolic reaction comes from that small percentage of the energy of the sun that actually impinges on the planet. And actually, only a small amount of the energy that comes from the sun that actually hits this planet is taken up by photosynthetic organisms. Now, an interesting thing to keep in mind throughout our discussion is that all of the energy that is found in living systems today, with a few exceptions of those specialized organisms that use things like hydrogen sulfide, but we can ignore those. Almost virtually, the vast majority of all the energy that is found in living systems today ultimately comes from the sun, picked up by photosynthetic organisms, which then transmit that energy throughout all of the other living things in the planet. Now, when I say they transmit that energy, I want to point out that it's not like they're doing this of their own free will. The way that energy gets passed around is by heterotrophs like me eating those autotrophs. They capture the energy, they build organic compounds, and then heterotrophs will come along and take those organic compounds from them. Now, ultimately, the energy that's captured from the sun this way will eventually be all lost. The flow of energy from the sun to living organisms on this planet is a one-way street. Because after we consume those organic molecules, after we use them for something else, like extracting energy from them to build ATP, ultimately the energy in those molecules is dissipated as heat and it goes back into outer space. So you might think of it as a supply of energy coming in from the sun, getting used for a while by living organisms, and then going back out, dissipating into space. Fortunately, we should be able to maintain this supply for a few billion years longer. Well, to begin to understand how photosynthesis works, what I want to do is to go back to the chemical equation we discussed earlier that describes the oxidation of glucose to produce carbon dioxide, water, and heat. You'll recall that we spelled this equation out as C6H12O6, that's the chemical formula for glucose, plus 6O2, that's the chemical formula for oxygen, molecular oxygen. That combination, the C6H12O6 plus 6O2, will yield, at the end point of combustion, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 CO2, plus 6 water molecules, 6 H2O, plus some energy. Okay, so we have glucose plus oxygen yields carbon dioxide plus water plus energy. Now let me give you the chemical equation that summarizes the process of photosynthesis. Now if we wrote that out, we'd have 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O plus energy yields C6H12O6 plus 6O2. In other words, carbon dioxide plus water plus energy yields glucose plus some oxygen. Well, this is just exactly the reverse. The equation that describes cellular respiration, the breakdown of glucose, is exactly the reverse of the equation that describes photosynthesis, the synthesis of glucose from inorganic substances. Now, one obvious difference between this equation is where the energy occurs. Remember that when we're talking about cellular respiration, we're releasing energy as a result of this reaction. In photosynthesis, by contrast, what we're doing is putting energy into the reaction, obviously to drive it uphill energetically. But in fact, from the point of view of the basic chemical relationships involved, running the biochemical reactions associated with photosynthesis has essentially the same effect as running the reactions associated with cellular respiration backwards. Of course, this isn't actually how photosynthesis works. Just as we saw for cellular respiration, the process doesn't occur in a single reaction, as might be implied from the basic equations I've just given you. Instead, getting from carbon dioxide and water to a molecule of glucose involves a very long and somewhat complicated metabolic pathway. And furthermore, the reactions associated with photosynthesis are quite different from those reactions that were associated with cellular respiration. The fundamental equation for photosynthesis is just the reverse of the fundamental equation for cellular respiration, but the two sets of metabolic pathways barely intersect with each other. There are a couple of interesting points of intersection, but by and large, it's as though the biochemical route taken from glucose to carbon dioxide and hydrogen in the process of cellular respiration is a completely different route than the biochemical route that's taken to get back in the other direction by the processes associated with photosynthesis. Well, let's talk a little bit about what those processes of photosynthesis are in general. And just as we did when we were talking about cellular respiration, I want to begin by giving you kind of an outline of what we need to look at in order to understand how photosynthesis works. Actually, photosynthesis involves two distinct sets of processes. Now, these processes actually can be separated based on the function they serve overall. The first set of processes somehow must involve the cell of a plant or other photosynthetic organism capturing energy. And we know for photoautotrophs, this energy has to be captured from sunlight. This part of the process is referred to as the light reactions of photosynthesis. They're called the light reactions because they require light, sunlight, in order for them to run. Now, in the second process, the second set of reactions, the energy that's been captured from sunlight is then subsequently used to build glucose or other organic molecules. This second part of the process is referred to as the Calvin cycle, named in honor of Melvin Calvin, who actually had worked out many steps of this process on his own in the 1940s. The reactions of the Calvin cycle are sometimes also called the dark reactions of photosynthesis. Now, they're not called the dark reactions because they only run in the dark, but they're called the dark reactions because they don't require light for them to run. Why don't they require light? Well, they don't require light because the energy that runs them has already been captured from sunlight by the light reactions. So we have light reactions which are responsible for capturing the sunlight and then taking the captured energy and sending that over somehow to the dark reactions, which are the reactions that actually anabolically run the process, that actually run the anabolic processes by which glucose or other organic compounds are built. Okay, now that we have an overview of what photosynthesis does, let's take a look at where photosynthesis occurs in a photosynthetic organism's cells. Just as we saw to be the case for cellular respiration, some aspects of how photosynthesis works can only be understood by looking at the location of where these reactions take place. Now, the organelle where photosynthesis occurs, the organelle responsible for photosynthesis in a plant or an algae cell, is called the chloroplast. Again, we've seen chloroplasts before briefly when we talked about the basic organization of eukaryotic cells very early on in the course. Now, chloroplasts share some structural similarities with mitochondria, although there are also some substantial differences in their structure and in their function as well. Now, first, before I describe chloroplasts to you, I want to point out something that may be obvious, but if it isn't, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. All eukaryotic cells have mitochondria. Plants, animals, you name it. If you're a eukaryote, you've got mitochondria in your cells. And all eukaryotic cells use these mitochondria as the site where the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation occurs. However, only those eukaryotic cells that are capable of performing photosynthesis have chloroplasts. So what this means in general, if we wanted to simplify it, is to say that animals have mitochondria, whereas plants have both mitochondria because they've got to do cellular respiration too, and they have chloroplasts. Sometimes students of mine make the mistake to think that plants have got chloroplasts, animals have got mitochondria, and they're never the twain shall meet. Well, now let's talk about what these chloroplasts look like. Like mitochondria, chloroplasts have a very complex internal structure with different compartments separated by different membranes. Chloroplasts have both an outer and an inner membrane, similar to the outer and inner membrane that we saw in mitochondria. Now, unlike mitochondria, however, the inner membrane of chloroplasts is relatively smooth. Remember, in mitochondria, the inner membrane was very convoluted, forming those cristae, the finger-like extensions that extended into the inside of the organelle. The inner membrane of the chloroplast is almost as smooth as an outer membrane. Now, there is a space between the inner and outer membrane. It's the narrow space between these two membranes that we call, just as we did in mitochondria and just as uncreatively, the intermembrane space. Now, the space inside the inner membrane of chloroplasts is what is called the stroma. Now, where mitochondria and chloroplasts differ is that chloroplasts have actually a third membrane system, which is called the thylakoid membrane, or the thylakoid membrane system. It's this third membrane system that actually gives rise to all of the complexly shaped inner compartments that we do indeed see inside chloroplasts. These compartments that are formed by this innermost thylakoid membrane are called, as you might guess, thylakoids. These thylakoids actually often occur in relatively neatly layered stacks. It's as though you've stacked up a bunch of poker chips or something like that. And we call these stacks of thylakoids grana. That's plural, the singular is one granum. Now, all of the thylakoids inside of a chloroplast are actually interconnected. Although they form these nice disc-shaped structures called thylakoids, all of the thylakoids actually are connected by membranes themselves. So you can imagine that there is yet another inner space, the space that's inside the thylakoid membrane, that we call the thylakoid space. All right. The two processes of photosynthesis, the light reactions and the dark reactions, take place in different parts of the chloroplast. The thylakoids are the site where the light reactions occur. In fact, the enzymes that are responsible for the light reactions of photosynthesis are actually embedded in the thylakoid membranes themselves, and this fact is critical for the way that the light reactions work. The dark reactions, that is, the reactions associated with what's called the Calvin cycle, actually occur in the stroma of the chloroplast. That is, the enzymes responsible for these dark reactions and their substrates and products are not membrane bound, but simply dispersed in the fluid that fills this stromal space. Okay, well, that's a chloroplast. We've talked about what we need to do in photosynthesis. But the next thing we need to do before we go on is just take a little bit of a look at what light is, to get an idea of what we're working with here. Now, there are a couple of important things we need to know about light in order to understand how photosynthesis works as we go along. The first thing to point out is that light is a form of energy called electromagnetic radiation. Now, in our own perceptual experience, we literally see electromagnetic radiation of different wavelengths as being different colors. In fact, we can only see a very small range of wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation with our eyes. We call this range of wavelengths the visible light spectrum. Now, an interesting thing to know about electromagnetic radiation is that it can be modeled as waves, and we often think of it this way when we refer to, for example, different wavelengths of light, but it also can be modeled in terms of particles. This is because the energy in electromagnetic radiation occurs in discrete, discontinuous packets, or what are called quanta. When we're talking about light, these packets, or quanta of light, are called photons. Now, fortunately, we don't need to know a lot about the physics of light in any great detail here. But a key point to keep in mind for the purposes of our discussion is that light energy comes in these discrete quantities called photons, with each photon being one packet of energy that might be transmitted from one entity to another. So let's ask what happens when a photon encounters some matter. For example, a photon encounters a molecule. Well, in general, one of three things might happen. The first possibility is that the photon will simply be reflected off. It'll be reflected off that matter and go someplace else. A second possibility is that the photon will just actually pass right through. We'd say that the photon is transmitted through that matter. But a third possibility is that the photon will be absorbed by the matter that it encounters. It'll be absorbed by a molecule that it encounters. It's this last case, the absorption of a photon by a molecule it encounters, that we're most interested in here. And the reason we're interested in this third possibility is that when a photon of light is absorbed by matter, it transfers its package of energy to that matter. Now, the essential problem that a plant cell has to overcome in order to accomplish photosynthesis is first to acquire some energy from sunlight. Does the fact that a photon can be absorbed by a molecule and transfer its energy to that molecule solve this problem? Well, not exactly. See, if it were that simple, then it wouldn't be clear that we'd be talking about photosynthesis in such detail in general anyway. Why would we need some extensive sets of biochemical pathways if, in fact, matter could just absorb this energy and do something useful with it? Again, the point here is that we need to not just have the energy, but we need to have it in a usable form. For example, if it was just easy enough to absorb energy and do something with it, then why couldn't I just go out and sun myself? Let those photons hit me. They're absorbed by many of my molecules. Why doesn't that energy that I absorb do me any good? Well, the reason is that in general, when a molecule absorbs a photon, it doesn't hold on to the energy for very long. In fact, when a molecule absorbs a photon, a quantum of electromagnetic radiation energy, what happens is that the energy in that photon is transmitted to the electrons in that molecule, causing those electrons to go to a higher energy state. So the molecule has gotten some energy, but it doesn't hold on to it for very long, because almost as soon as it absorbs that energy, those electrons will decay back to a lower energy state, and the energy will be emitted again. In fact, as a photon of electromagnetic energy. So what photosynthesis has to accomplish then is to absorb this energy, is to capture the energy that's absorbed from photons of light by molecules, but in such a way that it's able to hold on to this energy. Well, chlorophyll is a molecule that has evolved to be specialized for capturing light in a way that allows the energy in that light to be preserved and used in photosynthesis. Chlorophyll is a kind of a pigment molecule. And to look at it in detail, you would see that it has a head region. This head region is sometimes called a porphyrin ring, and it includes a magnesium atom in the center of it. The molecule also has a long tail, which is basically a long tail of a long hydrocarbon tail. And by this I mean it's just a long chain of carbon atoms with nothing but hydrogen atoms attached to them. Now, chlorophyll models, along with some related pigment models, are found embedded in the thylakoid membranes of chloroplasts, as I said. Note that the hydrocarbon tail of this molecule is actually similar to the tails of phospholipids that make up biological membranes. And so this hydrocarbon tail is well suited to help position the chlorophyll molecule in the membrane. Now, what happens when a photon of light hits a molecule of chlorophyll? Well, what happens in general when a photon is absorbed by a molecule, as I told you, is that it excites electrons in that molecule to a higher energy state. For most molecules, the electrons quickly decay back and the energy is lost. This is exactly what happens to a molecule of chlorophyll as well. If a molecule of chlorophyll absorbs a photon, it loses it. In fact, it emits it again as light. In fact, this process of emitting light back out is what we call fluorescence. Well, then what's so special about chlorophyll as a light-absorbing pigment? What's the big deal about chlorophyll? Well, the answer to this question is that a single chlorophyll molecule alone isn't much good, but a group of chlorophyll molecules organized together as something we call a photosystem can act as a very effective harvester of the energy found in light. Now, a photosystem is a collection of several hundred pigment molecules that are physically clustered together and tightly held together in the thylakoid membrane of a chloroplast. Along with molecules of chloroplasts, of chlorophyll, there are some other kinds of pigment molecules that generally are associated with these. We call these accessory pigments, and these accessory pigments will also absorb some of the light energy that impinges on them, but they'll do so better at different wavelengths than the principal kinds of chlorophylls we find making up photosystems. Now, here's the way photosystems work. The pigments found in a photosystem are so tightly packed together that when any one of them absorbs a photon, it will lose this package of energy, but instead of emitting this energy back out, it will transfer this energy to an adjacent chlorophyll molecule. So when a photon excites one of the electrons in one of the molecules of a photosystem, that one molecule will have its electrons return to a low energy state, but it'll pass the energy that it gives off to an adjacent molecule. And the energy will be passed around from molecule to molecule, sort of like passing around a hot potato. Now, this isn't buying us anything in itself either, but part of the photosystem is what we call the reaction center, in the center of the photosystem. And in the reaction center, there's another kind of molecule called a primary electron acceptor molecule. When a photon reaches a chlorophyll molecule that's adjacent to the primary electron acceptor, the elevated energy level of the electron in the excited chlorophyll actually allows a redox reaction to occur, an oxidation-reduction reaction. As a result of that oxidation-reduction reaction, the excited electron in the chlorophyll that has now the packet of energy originally absorbed from the photon that hit the photosystem, that excited electron will actually be transferred to the primary electron acceptor molecule. In other words, an electron is now actually moved from one molecule to another. And you might begin to be able to see where we're going to go with this. Because when we just had the energy of the photon moving from one molecule to another, there really was nothing stable happening that we could hold on to. But as soon as an excited electron actually gets passed to another molecule, the electron acceptor molecule, through a redox reaction, now we've captured the energy that originally impinged on this photosystem in the form of a photon. The energy is now stored in an electron that has been moved to another molecule, just as we saw in redox reactions that we talked about in the context of cellular respiration. Now, what happens as a result of this electron being captured this way? Well, what happens in a nutshell is that energy that has been captured in an electron is transferred by a series of biochemical steps from a relatively unusable form, that is, an electron, to a relatively usable form, that is ATP. How that works is what will begin with the next lecture.